And you might say, well, my life is so horrible. What do I have to be grateful for? And I would say that's, for better or worse, that's still a form of blindness, right? I mean, people can have very, very difficult situations, can be in very, very difficult situations. And it's in those difficult situations where the search for gratitude becomes something that is by necessity deeper and more difficult. But that doesn't mean it's not appropriate. And there is a very tight association between loving your enemy and being grateful in spite of the terrible things that occur in your life. I've been writing about the book of Job, and Job is a story of unjust suffering, fundamentally. God deems Job a good man, so we have it on God's word that Job is actually a good man, and then all hell breaks loose, partly because God makes a bet with Satan, which is, a hell of a thing to do, and says, do your worst. He's not going to turn on me no matter what you do. And so Job, despite his torment, he becomes very ill. He loses everything he has. He becomes ill in a way that's disfiguring. His friends come around and laugh at him and tell him that he's a bad man, and that's why all these terrible things have been happening to him. And it's brutal. And Job refuses to lose faith in himself. He says, look, I'm not perfect, but as far as men go, I've done what I should do, and I'm not being punished in some manner that's obviously related to my sin. It's more like the random play of tragic forces in the world. I'm not going to lose faith in myself no matter what. And I'm also not going to, his wife says, shake your fist at God, curse him and die. Because things have gone so badly for Job, she thinks that's all that's left to him, and he refuses to do that. So he maintains faith regardless of what's happened to him. And that's really the moral of the story of Job, which is that you are morally obligated to maintain faith no matter what happens to you. And there's a practical side to that. So imagine that God and Satan conspire against you. There'll be times in your life where it feels like that's happening. And then imagine that your reaction to that is to become bitter and resentful and hostile. Well, then whatever hell you're in, merely as a consequence of the confluence of tragic events, you have opened a whole other hell underneath it. The hell of bitterness and resentment and ingratitude, and that turns into the desire for revenge very, very quickly. If you think things are bad just because they're bad, you wait till you see how bad they can become if you allow yourself to be corrupted by your unjust suffering, right? And so I do think that this is the most practical possible advice that can be given to people, which is that you are morally required to maintain faith, to aim up, and to treat other people the way you would want to be treated, no matter what's happened to you. And that's a hell of a thing to say. And, you might say, well, that's impossible. Some people have such brutal lives that they're destined to be corrupt. But I would say that's not true. Like, I've met many people, particularly in my clinical practice, who had lives that were so brutal that you couldn't even listen to them without it, like, breaking you into pieces. Brutal childhoods of a depth of malevolence you can hardly conceptualize, who decided, despite that they were going to aim up and they were going to maintain faith in themselves and the world. And so it's like, that's on the table for people.
It seems like an odd paradox that the people who have been brought up under lives of the most privileged are often the ones that have the most complaints about the world, and people who have been brought up in deprivation a lot of the time are able to be perfectly in gratitude. It seems very strange that's the way.
So one of the things I saw at the university, I saw the faculty members, my peers, retreat in the face of the advancement of the administration over like 3 decades, to the point where the universities really became corrupted. And it didn't really happen at Harvard when I was there in the 1990s, although it was starting to fray around the edges slightly, but I really watched it at the University of Toronto in the 20 years I was there. The administration kept making demands on us, and every time they made a demand, we would fold. Every time. 10,000 micro-retreats. So then the administrators took over the university, and then the woke types took over the administration, and that was that. Well, what I saw my faculty members do, the academics that I worked with, is that this is how the corruption starts. It's like when you're an undergraduate, you write down what you think the professor wants to hear to get the grade. And then you're a graduate student and you have to, let's say, get along with your professors and your supervisor. You have to tell them what you think they want to hear so that you can get your PhD. And then maybe you are on the academic track and you're an assistant professor. There's 3 levels of being a professor. You're not tenured as an assistant. So you really can't say what you think or do what you think you should do then, because you have to get tenured. And then when you're tenured, well, you're not a full professor yet. And so you don't speak then. And back in the back of your mind, you have this idea, well, at some point, I'll have enough security so that I'll be able to tell the truth. But that's based on this weird idea that the courage to tell the truth is based on security. Well, courage isn't based on security. That's a stupid theory. You're not courageous if there's no risk. So your notion is you'll be courageous when there's 0 risk. Well, obviously that's a contradiction in terms. You're only courageous if there's a risk. And not only that, by the time you've sacrificed your word for illusory security for 15 years, there's nothing left of you that's true. That's gone a long time ago. You probably look back at the former self who was naive and thought that you could say what you think as just, well, you're cynical about it. You know, that person just didn't know how the world worked. And then it's the same thing that you pointed out. The idea that you become good because you have material plenty. That's a silly idea.